You're chasing ghosts, Elias, and when you finally fall, don't expect us to catch you. Those were my father's words, delivered not with anger but with a cold, clinical pity that cut deeper than any insult. They were spoken in a crowded boardroom, surrounded by the elite of the Marine Engineering Association. I had presented my findings, data on the microscopic structural fatigue in our aging coastal sentinels, the subtle shifts in granite foundations caused by rising tides. I wasn't just presenting a report, I was sounding an alarm, but to them I wasn't a specialist, I was a relic, a crackpot, a man obsessed with a bygone era. I watched as the very people I had worked alongside for a decade turned their backs, laughing behind polished mahogany desks. They didn't just dismiss my research, they dismissed my sanity. They mocked the idea that a human, a manual steward, could ever be more effective than their automated, silicon-based sensors. I left that room with nothing but my integrity and a heavy, hollow ache in my chest. The departure was quiet, which made it more painful. I didn't storm out. I just packed my gear and left the city to find a life that made sense, even if that life was one the world had deemed obsolete. I moved to the edge of the world. I sought out the forgotten. I found myself in a salt-sprayed, crumbling lighthouse on a jagged outcrop that the modern shipping lanes had long since bypassed. I became a ghost among ghosts. I spent my days climbing iron ladders that groaned under my weight, cleaning glass that hadn't been touched in decades, and studying the very stone they said was indestructible. It was lonely, it was grueling. It was a pursuit that the world called futile. There were nights when the wind howled with such ferocity that I wondered if my father was right. There were seasons when the isolation felt less like a choice and more like a prison. I was a man trying to light a candle in a hurricane, while the rest of the world moved on to digital precision. But as I worked, something happened. I wasn't just cleaning glass. I was listening to the coast. I realized that their sensors were too sophisticated to detect the subtle, organic shifts in the shoreline. They were programmed to look for what they expected to see, not what was actually happening. My manual stewardship allowed me to see the heartbeat of the coastline. I began to integrate my structural observations with traditional stewardship, creating a hybrid model of living safety. I wasn't just keeping a light, I was monitoring an ecosystem. The turning point came during the Great Surge. A massive, unforeseen storm system, one that bypassed every digital warning system in the region, slammed into the coast. The automated beacons, reliant on GPS-linked satellite data, were momentarily blinded by the electromagnetic interference of the storm's sheer intensity. Ships were drifting into the breakers. The automated systems were failing precisely because they lacked the human intuition to adapt to the unprecedented chaos of the sea. I was there, in my tower, with my manual controls and my localized, ground-level observations. I didn't rely on a satellite. I relied on the vibration in my feet and the light in my hands. I steered the vessels through the dark, providing the human element that technology had forgotten. When the storm cleared, the world realized that the obsolete man had saved the coastline. The transformation was rapid. The crackpot became the architect of the new coastal safety initiative. My method, the blend of tradition and cutting-edge structural monitoring, became the global gold standard. I wasn't just a lighthouse keeper. I was the head of a global movement that transformed barren, eroding coastlines into protected, thriving marine sanctuaries through proactive, human-led stewardship. Years later, I returned. I wasn't the broken man who had walked out of that boardroom. I was the man the world had come to rely on. I returned to my hometown, not for revenge, but for closure. I attended the annual Marine Safety Gala, the very event where I had been humiliated. I walked into the ballroom and the room went silent. The air grew heavy. I saw them in the corner, my family, and the very engineers who had laughed at me. They looked older, their faces etched with the stress of a world that was struggling to keep up with the very environmental disasters I had predicted. My father stood up. He looked at me, and for the first time in my life I didn't see pity in his eyes. I saw awe. I saw a profound, crushing realization of what he had lost. Elias, he whispered, his voice trembling, we saw the reports, the new protocols, they say you've changed everything. I looked at him and I felt a strange, quiet peace. The anger was gone, replaced by a clarity I could only have gained in the solitude of my tower. I didn't change the world, Father, I said, my voice steady and resonant. I simply listened to what it was trying to tell me. You were looking at the screens, but you forgot to look at the sea. One of the former lead engineers approached me, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and desperate hope. We were wrong, Elias, the digital models. They couldn't see the cracks. Only you could. There was no need for a grand confrontation. There was no need to gloat. The justice was in the silence. The justice was in the fact that the world had pivoted toward the very truth they had ridiculed. They had spent their lives building digital walls, while I had learned to walk with the tide. I stood there, a man who had turned a ridiculous dream into a lifeline for the world. I realized then that our greatest purpose often lies in the things others call useless. When the world tells you that your passion is obsolete, remember, the light doesn't need permission to shine. It just needs to stay lit. As I walked out of that hall and into the cool night air, I didn't look back. I had a coastline to watch, a light to tend, and a future that was finally, undeniably bright.